Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. It's that time of year where we talk a little bit about the end of the year and a lot about what's coming. So, Jim, you have some thoughts on what happened last year and where we're at.
Well, yeah, I'm finishing up the annual wars update, which will come out on the 4th, I believe, Monday. And one thing I noted was the trends we predicted last year are still underway. In other words, there are fewer wars. We dropped 4 that, like many, as was pointed out in Strategy Page, when we drop regular coverage of an area, that is simply there's not enough bloodshed there to justify, covering it regularly. And the death rates keep coming down. And you check any source that monitors, worldwide violence or global terrorism, and you'll find that basically the same numbers. They vary a little bit, but it's all basically the same. And this has been a trend that's been going on since the end of the Cold War, and that was mainly because the Russians were financing and supporting in many ways a lot of the rebellions, so to speak, and uprisings around the world. And when that money dried up, just like North Korea found out, boy, you're in bad shape. In fact, the only two people on there was a thing started, the financial FA something or other. We cover it in the Pakistan section, the India-Pakistan section. They set up international group, mainly the major banking nations, as it were, the nations that basically supply the international finance community. If you want big loans or to sell bonds, you have to have the approval of this operation. These countries. Well, they agreed to go after countries that were supporting terrorism, either because they were allowing money laundering or unidentified transactions or what have you, and doing it via the international financial network. They would be blacklisted or gray-listed first and then blacklisted. Only 2 countries are on that list. Because everybody else who comes close, gets on that gray list, scrambles to get off it. And the 2 countries on the list are Iran and North Korea. So you see a pattern there. Pakistan, well, I got more stuff coming up, in Strategy Page on that. They're really scrambling. In fact, they threw Mullah Rasul. He was the head of the Afghan Taliban until one of our missiles got him inside Pakistan in 2016. They threw him under the bus when they recently, one of their anti-terrorism courts, they released the guy who beheaded David Pearl, the reporter on video. They released him from prison, but they went after the dead Rasul and seized a life insurance policy he took out under a false name. He never got paid, but they went after the insurance company and got the $2,000 in premiums he'd already paid, as well as I think a couple $100,000 worth of real estate that he had bought. But they're this close, really. They've had a couple near rapes, and they've only been kept off by China going to bat for them in the UN. But China's apparently told them, we can't protect you anymore. You guys are too incorrigible. Chinese are not crazy about the way Pakistan supports, terrorism. In fact, I don't know if I mentioned in this update, but 3 of the top terrorism nations, and with terrorism, deaths, as it were, and attacks, are Afghanistan, Pakistan, and way down on the list, India. And the main source of terrorism support for all 3 is the Pakistani military, which, again, we cover regularly, and that's become a real soap opera in Pakistan, where the population is getting tired of being, an army with a country attached. But that's one of the trends that keeps going on now, despite the fact that Pakistan has nuclear weapons, or the Pakistani military has nuclear weapons. That's a distinction which is becoming even more important as time goes on. They're unlikely to use them because they're facing suicide. I mean, these guys are fairly pragmatic. They thought they could basically score some big victories. They could control Afghanistan, and they could basically get Kashmir back by covertly supporting Islamic terrorism groups who would attack on the orders, as it were, of the Pakistani military. Well, that's been pretty much fully exposed now. That's why they're rolling closer and closer to getting on that blacklist, which will be devastating. Because one bad effect that the military has had on Pakistan is not just the large chunk of the budget, much higher than any other country in the region, that goes to the military, but the fact that they've used their leverage, as it were, to gain ownership. Sort of like the mob saying, hey, a nice company you have here, it'd be a shame, if something should happen to it. And bingo, they become part owner or eventually complete owner. I mean, it's really the mafia military, you might call it. There's a title to run with, Austin. But the
it's very accurate, Jim.
Exactly. But their comeuppance is coming because Pakistani's credit rating is reached zero. And the military hasn't got a credit rating. The country has a credit rating, and it's gone. Forced to choose between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Pakistan equivocated mainly because the military, the civilian government, the civilian politicians were all for sticking with Saudi Arabia, which had always been a good friend, as it were. But now they feel that, maybe it's better if we stay tight with Iran, which is right next door, rather than far away in the Arabian Peninsula. But that's caused them a lot of bad press inside of Pakistan. So that's something that's going to continue. It's going to get worse. And in fact, it may come to head, so to speak, to a crisis point in Pakistan. And you might see a fundamental change in governance there, which means they have to get their military under control. By the way, India, which was created at the same time, a lot of Muslim politicians insisted they had to have their own Muslim country, and that's where Pakistan came from. An idea that I think people will eventually say, this isn't really working very well. But India put strict controls on the military, so much so that the military is kind of crippled because of it. But that's another story which we cover regularly. But in Pakistan, the military basically took over in all but name, and it's ruined the country. And what goes around eventually bites you in the butt, and that's what's happening in Pakistan. But worldwide, you're seeing more countries with similar situations to Pakistan, like Mali. The military intervened. Thailand and Burma, two countries that we basically stopped covering regularly because the military there in both countries is being forced to allow the elected government to be the final arbiter of what is good for their respective countries. There's been so many coups in Burma. In Thailand, it's not so much the military interfering. It's the military. How should I put it? Military kind of supports, the traditionalists who aren't willing to be flexible when it comes to, for example, dealing with the Muslim minority in the South, which is where most of the violence was since 2004, which has now died out, as these things usually do. But Burma again was part of the Indian Raj, the Indian colony, and they did not control their military. And by the 1960s, the military had taken over until 2010. So you have situations like this all over the world, which were not impacted by the fall of communism, because they were all basically, run by the intelligence agencies which answered to Moscow or controlled. They had the Russians had the final say on anything. But you had so-called democratic countries, or non-communist countries, who suffered from this problem. These things only last so long. As Margaret Thatcher put it, when you run out of other people's money, you've got a huge problem and not many viable solutions. So that is bringing peace. The bankruptcy of the military-controlled countries. And Pakistan is probably one of the major examples. Another example, which we don't pay that much attention to from this angle, is China. We called out China as the modern Nazi Germany because basically they're a dictatorship, a socialist dictatorship, like the National Socialist Nazis who were running Germany, but they're a market economy. In other words, they have a lot of economic freedom, so they don't try the Russian, the pure communist state control of the entire economy. That does not work. The Chinese realized that before the Russians did, and they did something about it. But then they found out there's a price attached, in that they could eventually lose the party could eventually lose control. Now that's spinning out of control for China. Everybody's saying, "Oh, the economy's going to keep growing. They're going to become the biggest in the world, et cetera, et cetera." Well, they were saying that about Japan in the 1880s, but they had a big bust, the same kind of bust that China is headed for. Now, there's nothing the military can really do about that. The Chinese Communist government, actually, for all the money they've been giving the military, in the last 30 years, it's all in proportion to the growth of the economy. And they've tried to cut back on the corruption in the military, which is a historical facet of China. It's always been that way, and things really don't change. But the absolute control of the Communist Party, which makes the military, which basically forces the military, requires the military to swear allegiance and to protect the Communist Party of China, not China, because the myth is that the Communist Party is China. Well, a lot of Chinese would beg to differ. They say the Chinese China is the Chinese people. And they're beginning to realize that the current government, the communist government, was basically just another aristocratic dynasty with a new set of clothes. But again, that's what the Chinese basically have. The military at the behest of a powerful absolutist communist party. Is basically there to keep that party in power and to keep themselves in cash, because their only way, and the Chinese politicians, the Communist Party leaders, they literally say this. This sometimes leaks into the press, at least the Chinese press, that if you don't, be faithful to the party, another way of saying do what we say and no messing around, we will not give you more money. And they have cut the budget a couple of times. I mean, the budget still went up, but they cut areas where they found that the generals or the admirals were not perhaps, jumping high enough when the party said jump. So these little wars, these how should I put it, invisible wars keep going on. And they only become visible, when basically there's a major change. Like happened in Burma when they allowed the democracy to return after almost 50 years, and in Thailand where they had one coup too many, and they tried to change the institution to give the army a permanent veto in a democratically elected parliament, and that's basically getting a lot of pushback. So you have that problem that is ancient, but dressed up in like I say, new clothing. And despite controlling the media, which they did in Russia during the 90s, the media was fairly free, and all sorts of interesting stuff was coming out, which displeased the political classes, which contained a lot of former KGB officers. And Mr. Putin, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer in Germany when the Cold War ended. He basically got his cronies together, and when things were spinning out of control, he took over. I mean, he got elected. He basically said, "I'll bring order." He knew but the KGB were very clever guys, and they still are. and now they're in charge. But again, a lot of Russians are figuring out, since the blowback from the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and all the sanctions by their major trading partners. And the decline, and probably a very long-term decline in the price of oil, they're suffering. Again, we report this. Even Russians have statistics which is still fairly straight about the increasing cost of living, the lower personal CPU income, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, China. One thing I dug up recently was that in the next few years, China will have a higher GDP per capita than Russia. And this is saying something because China still has hundreds of millions of poverty-stricken rural residents. There's a huge amount of affluence on the coast where most of the economic development took place in the last 30 years. And they've been slow to spread it into the interior. Which is poor for a reason. It's basically agricultural. A lot of it's marginal agricultural area. Smartest thing the Russians ever did, as painful as it was to all concerned, was to the one-child policy, which stopped the population explosion from destroying China. But at the same time, it's caused a huge labor shortage because now they're faced with a generation of little princes, they call them. These kids are spoiled. Like crazy because they got two sets of grandparents doting on them as well as their own parents. And the military has problems. And, of course, there aren't enough of them to go around. They do the work that has to be done. So plus they have the same banking problems, a bubble, as it were, that Japan had that is about to go bust. And when it does, it's going to have more serious effects on China than on Japan. It stopped the tremendous growth rate of the Japanese GDP and economy, but it could have more serious implications for the empire, as it were, the communist dynasty. Beyond that, there's less violence, less wars, less people getting killed. What's to complain about? Well, if you're in the media business, you have to find wars and make the most of what you got because good news doesn't sell.
Austin, your thoughts on 2020 as it closes?
Well, Jim and I had a discussion, or actually, email exchange about retiring Sudan, and I made a Instapundit post out of it. I think that actually attracted some readers to some of our wars updates that we normally wouldn't get. But I made a point in this post, and Dan, I know you've seen it, but we had been covering Sudan since 1999. Now, from, I want to say September, you can go back, listeners can go back and look in the archives. From September 99 to maybe sometime in early 2000, you'll see some scattered reports in there. But Jim, as I recall, it was in like spring 2000, I started doing the Sudan regularly.
Yeah.
And we went through, this doesn't apply just to Sudan, but if you go back and look at some of our updates prior to, say, fall 2003 or spring 2004, we'd sometimes do them by dates instead of kind of a consolidated monthly update, sometimes every 6 weeks or whatever. I'm just giving readers who listeners unfamiliar with it, the process of developing how we covered some of these crises. I shouldn't not just call them crises. And Sudan was an example of a region perpetually at war. As a matter of fact, sometimes we'd refer to it inside strategy pages, Greater Sudan, in the same way you'd talk about Greater Serbia or Greater Greece, Greater Turkey, because you had a cadre, and it was around in Khartoum, around a former general by the name of Omar al-Bashir, who actually seized power in the late 1980s. But the group that he was in, an army-run state, really, is what it was, had really held power in Khartoum since the early 1960s. The army, in this case, the military, benefited from some of these troubles. And they also had aligned themselves. This is in Sudan. This is something else that you'll see in other places, not just in Muslim nations, but they had eventually aligned themselves with a more radical Islamist political extremists, which protected their ideological flank. You see that in Pakistan as well. Jim was talking about where the Pakistani army was. Pakistani army lined up and with supporting elements that we would identify as Taliban. They certainly support the Taliban in Afghanistan, but there's a couple of Pakistani Muslim extremist groups that are really terror organizations that largely attack India, not just India, but the Pakistanis did the same thing. The Sudanese military did that as well in their own region. So I'll trolley back to 2000. We would follow primarily the war that had been going on really since the early 1980s between southern Sudan, which is predominantly black African, extensive number of Christians, Catholics, and Anglicans for the most part, and animists. There were various demographic breakdowns as to how many of each, but usually the typical figure was about 20% of those tribes are animist spirit worshippers. And some of the sources on this, I remember researching and said, why does this crop up? You'd find that actually from sectarian sources, like the Catholic Church, and also the Anglican Church, and some non-governmental organizations that were working with these tribes, not just in southern Sudan, but also in northwestern Kenya, and to a limited extent in Uganda. Now, Uganda, you got into at that time the Lord's Resistance Army. Remember that one?
Yeah.
Joe Coney and the like. I won't go there, except it actually works in to covering Sudan, because the LRA in many ways was relied on the Khartoum government's intelligence services for support. I mean, the evidence for that is absolutely 100% solid. So there you had, so this is why when I'd call it Greater Sudan, or Jim and I would look at it, you'd also see how Sudan got into it with Ethiopia, Kenya. It had some issues with Chad. It had a kind of standoff relationship with Libya, which was under Gaddafi. And even though Sudan is tied to the Nile, and lower Nile is Egypt, and on the upper Nile, because the Blue Nile and White Nile intersect at Khartoum and Omdurman, its relationship with Egypt at times would go tilt, because there's this is still in dispute. There's a triangle of territory that Egypt occupies. Sudan has a very tenuous claim to it, but it's also one of these border claims, and Jim's talking about military regimes. Those get mined, M-I-N-A, as in mining them, using them for galvanizing ideological purposes. You see this in China with China's claims on this. But let's put this packet of territory to the side. What I've described is a very complex, a complex country. Say, hey, every place is complex. Yes, but this is divided by tribes, languages, religion, and there were one big serious war, and that was between the North and the South. Understand the South did have some support from Kenya, Great Britain, indirectly the United States, mostly Americans giving money to organizations to try to support, provide medical aid and food. But the Kenyans and ultimately the Ugandans were helping their brethren to the north. Kenya is overwhelmingly Anglican. You've got Anglicans and Catholics in Uganda, and there was the ethnic element to it. There are 4 or 5 smaller tribes that spill over the border on Uganda and Kenya and South Sudan, the classic African issue. We had this complex situation that, from our perspective, this was an example of the ongoing unresolved warfare that at the same where real issues were on the table. The Southerners, we don't want to be dominated by these Islamists and the proof of Islamic slaving, Islamic tribes. One of them you'll still see cropping up every once in a while, the Misriya, which was an Arabized tribe, would go down and capture Nur, Dinka, some of the other tribes in South Sudan, and the captured, kidnapped, whatever, would end up being seen working in Khartoum or doing a house service or working in warehouses or whatever, and they could be bought back for anywhere from $100 to $300 if you could find them. Many of these people, of course, were never found. This was a huge bone of contention in 2005 when the Comprehensive Peace Agreement came about. And the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, for what it's worth, ultimately led to the secession of South Sudan. Now, for 21 years, we had enough conflict in Sudan to warrant monthly updates. But in April of 2019, Bashir was toppled, and really it was December of 2018 when the country, Jim said, people get tired of this. Basically, the technocrats, educated, and large elements of the urban working class, which exist in Sudan, said, we're tired of it. And they started massive street demonstrations. Of course, they got shot by some of the police, RSF, Rapid Support Forces, which is a militia that grew out of the Janjaweed and the militias that attacked in Darfur. Notice I left Darfur out completely out of this. There's a UN peacekeeping mission going on in Western Sudan. Boy, did we cover that! But the process that Sudan has gone through really since April of 2019 is remarkable. They finally got a technocrat, economist, prime minister, Hamdok, who really meant it about creating avenues to promote participation in government in Sudan instead of oppressing them. A real outreach to these armed rebel groups. Some of the rebel groups are quite sophisticated. There are a couple that are actually just organized gangs. I think they're ultimately going to be the type that this is something we would cover in an update. But Jim noticed this, and I'm writing about it not just in updates. I did 4 or 5 columns for Creator Syndicate on Sudan from spring 2019 on. 4, I think, is what I did, about the rather remarkable progress in this. Here's a good news story. And it look, Sudan had been on the U.S. State Department's state sponsor of terrorism a list since when? The early 1990s, mid 1990s. It was finally removed in fall 2020. They had to deal with the compensation issue for the survivors and the families of Americans who were killed in terrorist attacks linked to the Khartoum government. That included the USS Cole attack in Yemen in 2000, which was an Al Qaeda attack, and it also included the 1998 terror bombings of the American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. But it reached a point that despite all of and I noted this in that long post I wrote on the last regular Sudan update, and Jim, I think, ran that on the 28th of December or something like that. I forget, whatever, maybe it's 27. That we'd reached a point where what we would be reporting would be basically the same report on of a country trying to tamp down the residual, trying to address the legitimate grievances and tamp down on the residual violence in the nation, rather than being at war with itself. There's still a ton of problems because the military is very powerful in this transitional government they've got. But they have got a lot of international support in moving towards a elected civilian government. And if it fell apart, we'd go back to monthly updates. The lesson in this, first of all, is that we're not going to cover it unless we can provide something new about a truly grievous situation. But it can happen, and as Jim said, I've gone through some details on it. This is part of a trend that we've seen in other places around the planet. Are we going to see more of this in 2021? Of course, I can't make a prediction like that, Dan, but here's a comparison that I can make. We used to cover Peru, really, and the cocaine war that was going on in Peru. Peru still has, in the high Andes, violent military-type clashes that involve the police and army taking on remnant Sendero Luminoso guerrillas. That was a Maoist group in Peru. But what they're doing is acting as a militia, providing protection for drug gangs. And it's similar to some of the clashes that the Mexican military has with drug gangs in various places within Mexico. But notice we retired Mexico as well, because the combination there of ideological dimension and slow isolation, ultimately, these guerrilla groups were criminal gangs, and it became more of a criminal war. And we'll do the police blotter when it's required. That's been part of the trend that Jim was talking about. Oh, did Peru have a military government? Well, Jim will tell you, well, it had a superficial civilian government. Actually, the civilian government is stronger in Peru than it is in many other places. But the thing is that the country relied on the military, not just for security, but also for political security for the elites, which is something else Jim was pointing out about going on in China. So I know I got off talking in some detail about it, but there in that detail you see the examples of this larger trend that we're talking about seeing less warfare. and where it's been going, and that's the reason that we've retired. As in Jim's note on the Sudan update, we've retired more wars than we've added.
So, Jim, what do you see for 2021?
More of the same. Syria has been, well, how should I put it? It's been stumbling towards peace. The main obstacle to peace in Syria is Iran, which is obsessed with doing something violent towards Israel. So far, they've been unsuccessful. They've taken more losses, far more losses than they've inflicted. They've inflicted basically no losses on Israel. This infuriates the radicals in Iran, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they are basically running the show. Now, this is tremendous. This is very unpopular in Iran. It's one of the major reasons for the unrest, which has been going on since 2018. Now, in 2019, they killed over 1,000 civilians to stop the large demonstrations, but the demonstrations eventually came back, smaller. They tried to basically keep them from escalating to the point where the IRGC would call out their armed response troops. They have both full-time troops for this, as well as a large reserve, the Basish, who are basically street thugs, but they basically are believers. They get preference in government jobs, et cetera, and all they have to do is basically show up when called and beat down, these students or whoever else is out there, protesting the billions of dollars that Iran has been spending on Syria, while people are getting poorer and poorer inside of Iran. They basically will have to they got to do something. Even if they do something very violent inside Israel and kill a lot of Israelis, that really won't change the military balance, as it were, between Israel and Iran. It'll simply make the Israelis angrier. The Israelis have a tendency to provide payback for any attacks like this, so more Iranians will die. A lot of more than half the casualties in Syria, Iranian casualties, are basically Iranian mercenaries who tend to be either Iraqis, Lebanese, or Afghans, of all things. The Afghans are the best, but they also have to pay higher rates for them because the Afghans know they're better at that sort of thing. They used to have a lot more of those mercenaries, but they cut way back in late 2019 and early 2020 because they simply didn't have the money anymore. Much to the dismay of the IRGC, the clerics who ran the government called out their accountants and said, "Look, the money's not there. We'll give you as much as we can get away with, but it's going to be less than half of what you're accustomed to getting." So there were huge layoffs in Lebanon, where Hezbollah obtained most of their income from Iran. And of course, Assad, his government. But the trouble with Assad, whom the Israelis, by the way, are trying to arrange discussions with via Russia. Because as far as they're concerned, putting Assad back in charge of the entire country is no worse than before the war, when Assad was in charge of the whole country. The country is a lot poorer. There's not going to be any free weapons from Russia or anybody else. Syria is worse than broke. So they will have Assad in power with very few chemical weapons, a lot fewer rockets, a lot fewer of everything that they could use to threaten Israel. And of course, even Assad, being a flexible guy that he is, the current Assad, the son of the original Assad, he says, look, you got to be pragmatic about these things. Peace is peace, especially if we get Iran off our back. The trouble is right now that the Assad government has Iranian IRGC people, all through the place acting as advisors, or minders, they probably refer to it as, and they could rapidly, how should I put it, decapitate the Assad government and find some other Syrians who are more willing to follow orders from Iran in order to be in charge. But actually, without the Assad the Assad clan does have a lot of assets for being in power for so long. They developed contacts. They have not just the Shia minority in Syria, but a lot of the non-Muslim groups. They basically developed close ties with because they can depend on these people more than they can depend upon the Sunni Arab majority in Syria. But Israel just wants a peaceful northern frontier, and with Iran out of Syria and Lebanon, they would achieve that. In fact, if they could basically get the IRGC out of the region, they would have a peace in Gaza, because the only thing keeping Gaza afloat right now is money coming in from Iran, and some of that is being stopped because they didn't. Basically, Israelis will allow cash in, but only after negotiations. And the Iranians said, we're gonna negotiate with these SOBs, and they tried to sneak in, and boom, they got caught. So that's another little war you never hear about, but it's going on constantly. The Gazans still get food and medical supplies. That's scrutinized before it goes in, because they found that being used as a subterfuge for smuggling in weapons and materials for building rockets and what have you. So nobody's starving to death in Gaza, but there's a lot less money to tax, because even Egypt is cut off. Gaza. Egypt's at war with Iran. So people in that part of the world realize that being friends with Iran is not worth it. There's little to gain and much to lose by having Iran on your back. So this may happen. This may be the big breakthrough over there. You have the Abraham Accords, which apparently the new government in the United States will not try to repeal. They might, but they won't be very successful from the opinion polls I've seen. But whether or not that process could go forward to make peace with the Assads, that's another story, because that's really making a deal with the devil. But hey, if it's the devil and the devil who hasn't got too many choices, making peace with Israel is the least worst option. Then and the Israelis are willing to go along with it. You go with it. Nobody's been interested in getting involved in the fighting in Syria. There's only a small detachment of American Special Forces who are basically there to support the Kurds, who we can rely on, as we could in northern Iraq. But so things are probably going to get better. I don't think the fighting is going to escalate in a big way in Syria. And most indicators point for getting quieter and quieter, and the big tipping point is basically removing Iran from that region, the Mediterranean region of the Middle East, and if that is chancy, because you're dealing with fanatics here. I mean, the clerical dictatorship has shown a certain amount of circumspection in the way they run Iran. It's a dictatorship. They had the final say, but they allowed a certain amount of democracy. When that democracy got out of hand, trying to weaken or eliminate their dictatorial power, they would strike back. But they realized they can only strike back so much, because the Iranian people are sick and tired of it. They've had this for 30 years, going on 40 years, and it's ruined the country. And this is an open secret. People talk about it. It's street chatter. It's easy to develop contacts inside Iran. You got to deal with some encryption and what have you to get email out, or Tor network, whatever. But people do it, and a lot of it gets out, to the exiled Iranian media. There's a lot of English language versions of that in Europe and the United States. So it's no secret to the world or to the leaders in Iran that they have a problem. And the main obstacle is the IRGC. But the IRGC was established to basically keep a religious dictatorship in power. And what the mullahs, the ayatollahs, I should say, the senior clerics, are afraid of is that the IRGC, their defenders, might turn on them. Now, that's only been whispered about. Some of the more extreme members of the IRGC have muttered about that. But there's Iranians in general are smart enough, are savvy enough not to do stupid stuff like that. I mean, it was bad enough they got a religious government, which they weren't supposed to get. When the Shah was overthrown in '79, and then a year later, Saddam Hussein
got elected.
Saddam Hussein decides to invade Iran when they are weak. Well, they weren't that weak. And basically causes an 8-year war that gets 500,000 people killed and ruins the economies of both countries. Without that war, the clerics who were part of the revolution against the Shah, they basically had approved of free elections, not a religious dictatorship. But in wartime, they basically, it's like the old Roman Republic. You can elect a temporary dictator. Well, in this case, like this Julius Caesar, the dictator or his family turned out to be permanent, and they're stuck with it. And for a long time, they said, well, they promised that eventually when they clean things up, things will be better. But they've come to realize that the clerics and their families are as corrupt as the Shah ever was, and a lot more oppressive and killing a lot more Iranians. So that's something that's one of those historical processes that has to run its course. It's like in the late 1940s when the Cold War started. I think it was Keenan. He wrote an anonymous piece in Foreign Affairs or some journal saying that the best strategy with the Russians, now that they had nuclear weapons, was to basically just tolerate them until they self-destruct. Now, that was a very insightful and wise decision because nobody wanted nuclear war, including the Russians. They wouldn't admit it, but they were more terrified of a nuclear war than we were. And that's exactly what happened. Much to the surprise of a lot of Russians in the government, they had basically believed that they were there for the long term. But one of the things they had done was they had eliminated accounting as a profession, and literally there were very few people working for the Communist Party in Russia, in the Soviet Union, who could basically do accounting and give an accurate reading of exactly what shape the country was in. They eventually found out the hard way when they found out they had no more money. They had no more credit on the international market. They were basically broke. People were getting hungry, and boom, that was the end of that. And that advice is still, coaching. But, a lot of people don't follow what they want, an immediate solution. They're willing to be violent to get it and what have you. But the Assads and the Iranian radicals are finding out that they can only, rule by terror for so long, and eventually catches up with them. The Islamic State was a prime example of that because they decided to go into high gear, and that just meant their demise was quicker than usual. Al-Qaeda, which always took a more pragmatic approach, they're still operational, much more so than ISIL. But the problem with Islamic terrorism, radicalism, is that it's been around for 1,000 years. That's something it's still unfashionable in many parts of the West not to admit. They're admitting it in France now, after God knows how many French citizens have been killed by these maniacs. And a lot of countries, won't even let Muslims in. Japan is one example. They have no problem with Islamic terrorism. The worst thing they had was in the 1990s when they had a bunch of radical Buddhists. Now, that seems like something that shouldn't happen, but it does. And they were basically eliminated quickly after they launched the first and so far only terrorist attack with nerve gas. But there's Japan for you. Fortunately for the world, the Islamic radicals are regressives. They don't believe in modern they will make use of modern technology, but they can't develop their own. Boko Haram in Nigeria, which is still one of the main creators of Islamic terrorist, violence and deaths. Boko Haram literally means Western knowledge is forbidden. So this is not just a niche thing. This is mainline Salafism, another term for it, invented by an Egyptian intellectual. Anytime you do try to combine study, expansion of knowledge, respect for technology, as happened, in the early caliphate, in the about 1,000 years ago. You got this pushback. It flourished. This is what they talk about, when the Arab scholars, passed on the ancient knowledge of the Greeks. Well, they did over 1,000 years ago until they were shut down by the Islamic radicals. Said, you're not Islamic enough. You're becoming polluted with this foreign stuff. Allah, Muhammad would have never, backed this. Well, that's not true. But there's no central authority in Islam. There's no general agreement in Islam on much of anything. So you have all these different schools of Islam, and the radicals are the ones most willing to kill other Muslims to get their way. So that's been a struggle that's been going on inside of Islam, like I say, for over 1,000 years. And until the Muslims themselves can get together and agree to stop it, and they're aware of this now. I mean, there's open talk in the media, even in Saudi Arabia, that by hook or by crook, we have to solve this problem because it's mostly killing us. I mean, even during the war on terror after 9/11, even taking that into account, these terrorism deaths over the next decade, over 90% of them were Muslims. They may rejoice when, non-Muslims get killed by the Islamic terrorists, but that happens very rarely compared to the enormous number of, deaths inflicted on other Muslims. And that has not changed. For a while, they thought that, especially after 9/11, said, oh, yeah, now we're really going to stick it to the infidels, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it didn't work out that way. But it's been a very expensive mistake on their part and on the world's part because it cost the West trillions of dollars, to try and deal with it. But I think there's general consensus, even though a lot of countries don't admit it, that this is a problem within Islam and they have to solve it. And in the meantime, a lot of countries are restricting the entry of Muslim, immigrants or refugees. Several European countries, this is becoming a trend. They're insisting that if they want to get citizenship, not just refugee status, if they want to stay in the Netherlands or Denmark or you name it, the ones that have already signed, and now France, you have to acclimate to the local culture, not the other way around. We're not going to become part of some caliphate. And it's amazing. It took over a decade for, Western leaders to realize that. And a lot of them are still saying, oh, no. The Germans are still, sort of resistant to that, even though, you look at the statistics of who's committing the rapes and the murders and the terrorism attacks. It all tends to be one group. So, it's a coincidence. Well, no, it isn't. So that's slowly changing. But again, the Islamic terrorist violence was always a small portion of the violent deaths, as it were, that occurred every year, and it's been steadily declining. But it is called terrorism for a good reason. It terrorizes, and politicians have to pay attention to it, as do voters, because they're the ultimate victims. They haven't got the kind of security that can protect politicians, and they literally suffer most of the casualties when it isn't addressed on a national level.
Dan, let me make a couple of comments about that. Bonnie Sauter, who was an Iranian intellectual and oriented towards Western European democratic socialist politics. I mean, that's think France. These are rough analogies on it because he's from Iran, but French or German, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and he was the face of Iranian moderates during the Iranian Revolution. He actually had a lot of support, and he got elected president. In the election that was held, when I said it was, I think 1980, when Jim came in, and Jim was going to talk about Saddam's invasion of Iran. Bonnie Sauter said that the Khomeinists used the Iraqi invasion, which was a serious thrust at trying to take Khuzestan is what the Iranians call it, Arabistan is what the Arabs call it, but it's Iran's one of its chief oil-producing regions, and it's right on the Iraqi-Iranian border. Bani Sadr said that used that crisis to do something he wanted to do. I'm talking about the Ayatollah, which was impose an Islamic revolutionary state whose goal was global revolution. And he said that they undermined us. I'm using my terms from the Russian Revolution. Think of Bani Sadr and his group as the Mensheviks, and the Ayatollah Khomeini as the Bolsheviks, and you're not all that far off from what happened. Now, in at least 3 of the 4 editions of A Quick and Dirty Guide to War, Jim and I talked about or mentioned that there is this large number of Iranians. It's really, I think, a substantial majority that don't support, and they've certainly over the last 7 or 8 years, they've been decreasing support for the robed dictatorship, as they call it. The dictatorship has been under heavy challenge really since the end of 2017. And you can go and look at Iran updates. Some of the things were written in Yemen as well. I've done, I want to say, let's see, that's 3 years. I want to say I've done 4 or 5 columns on it that picks up on the Iran's internal dynamics. But more or less, continual protests or evidence of public dissatisfaction to the point of even, public protests that the regime cannot shut down, where they're calling for removal of officials, even change in Tehran. And there have been at least 2 very brutal acts of repression where either scores or a couple of hundred people were killed, both in Tehran and a couple of other larger cities. I'm talking about spates of violence. They weren't just localized in Tehran. The dissatisfaction is deep. And there are 2 things that really put a ton of pressure on the regime right now. One is this slow process, but it's real, of Muslim regimes, Arab Muslim regimes, reaching an accommodation with Israel. I didn't say a peace agreement. I think the UAE deal with Israel's a peace deal, and the Egypt deal, cold peace, but it's for real. The Egyptians have no interest in fighting the Israelis, and if anything, they act as allies in trying to deal with the Iranian troublemaking in Gaza and primarily in Gaza. And you've got Israel acting as a quasi-ally with the Arab forces that oppose the Iranian-backed rebels in Yemen. You've got Saudi Arabia, which for 20 years at least has recognized that the Saudis know they're real enemies of the Iranians, and that Israel really has their back, at least in terms of protecting airspace. There's open source information to support that. So you've got this momentum. Some of it was utilized, I should say that. It wasn't created by the Trump administration, but the Trump administration was aware of it and turned it into public diplomacy by getting these recognitions, or the situation between Sudan and Israel. It's not a peace agreement, but it's a fact that the Sudanese government has enough elements in there. And this is the case, the military is accused by some of the civilians of having made this quasi-deal with the Israelis without open consultation. I mentioned that in that last Sudan update. But it has to do with creating more stability and seeing Israel as both an economic and intelligence and political ally. And who does that put pressure on? Iran. The Ayatollahs seem to think that their way out is a revitalization of the JCPOA, the joint comprehensive plan that the Obama administration created. It was essentially paying Iran billions of dollars so that they would slow down their nuclear weapons program. Basically, that deal, which I said was a phony, and it was a complete phony, it has run its course, and the Iranians were cheating on it anyway. But that, to recreate that or bring it back, would give the dictatorship, the Iranian dictatorship, a victory both internally and internationally. They would not they suffer the penalties that they deserve to suffer for all of the murderous troublemaking that they are engaged in, not just in their own immediate Southwest Asia area and Africa, but they have tendrils into Europe, the Balkans, and also definitely Central Asia. And I bring that up because that's something that we're going to face in 2021 if there's a Biden administration. Is there going to be a demand by former Obama administration personnel who absolutely sold their soul that the JCPOA was a source of peace? It was not. It was a sort that Ayatollahs didn't use it for development. The money, they used it to wage more war. Now they've got all this other pressure points on them, increasing alienation of the Iranian people. Am I predicting a revolt in Iran? No, I'm not. I tell folks, go look at the introduction of the Iran chapter of the 1996 edition of a Quick and Dirty Guide to War, and definitely in 2008. The critical question is, when will the Iranian people be willing to spend their blood in the streets to the point that the Pasad Aran, the Revolutionary Guard, decides that they're going to quit shooting their own people? And then the regime's going to collapse internally. And they have yet to reach that point. But the pressure is reaching a point where the dictatorship itself has so many internal problems that there's a possibility it's going to collapse itself. I'm not going to put a date on it. But all those factors are there, and the release valve is the United States suddenly going back to an Obama administration type appeasement. I'll use that word, that we saw in 2015. Is that a big deal? It's a very big deal. And when you look at all of the little wars that we're still covering that can be traced back to Iran, and the terror that can be traced back to Iran as well.
Well, it's time for us to wrap up. So we'll continue to watch this year, and even though we're reporting on fewer wars, we will be covering development in armed forces around the world, and continue to cover military hardware, which is always going on, never slows down, and it will be part of our ongoing coverage. So
we'll be devoting more time. We've already been doing this to what's now being called great power competition, because that deals with the factors that you just raised. But then, of course, look at the stuff that Jim and I both write, and what Al Nofi provides in research on communist China, and big.
All right, we'll see you gentlemen next time.
Happy New Year, guys.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.